This is the view from my kitchen window on a bleak winter's morning, and if you look outside you can actually see the fog. Camera struggling just to pick up the trees in the background. So a foggy day, what better day to just curl up in front of the YouTube video and enjoy a nice story. So are you sitting comfortably? This is the Wikipedia page. Dr Paul Ehrlich, Nobel Prize winner, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading about his life and achievements. And it is the film that I will be relating to yourself, my memories of it. And here on the bottom of the page you have mention Ehrlich's life and work, 1940 film, Dr. Ehrlich, The Magic Bullet. And if you click on that link you will be taken to a page concerning the film The Magic Bullet. So I'll follow by the story of what I recollect of the film. Who is my hero for 2020? It's Dr. Paul Ehrlich, the Nobel Prize winner, who I would say was a forerunner of Cochrane. If you ever have an opportunity to watch The Magic Bullet, made in 1947, then I highly recommend it to you. At the time I was waiting for the physio because I had backache, and I was sitting on the settee. There was nothing I could do because I was in so much pain with my back. So I looked through the channels at the time that were available on the television, and on Channel 4 there was this black and white film called The Magic Bullet. It's called The Magic Bullet because that was the term used by Ehrlich to try and find the bismuth salt that would kill the syphilis organism, the spirochete, that little spiral bacterial that, without damaging the human body. So a bullet that would just kill the sexually transmitted disease syphilis without damaging the patient, hence this magic bullet. And I have very fond memories of this film, so I'm going to share them with yourself. I hope you're sitting comfortably. So the film starts off with Paul Ehrlich, Dr. Paul Ehrlich, drawing the screens round the young man, probably 19, 20 at the most of an age, and he was sitting on the couch, and the next thing he'd committed suicide because there was no treatment for syphilis, and to allow it to progress from the primary stage, which is just a sore under the foreskin, and then to a secondary stage, and then finally the third stage, the tertiary stage, where you would get large growths, overgrowths or granuloma in the brain, and the person would be admitted to a mental institution in a lot of pain, standing in odd positions, and it was agonizing. Nobody wanted it. So it was not uncommon that if the young person was told that he had syphilis, he'd commit suicide. Paul Ehrlich empathized with that young individual, and his goal was to find the treatment for syphilis. But syphilis at the time was seen as the punishment from God for sex outside marriage. So he was seen as a bit of a blasphemer, and sexually transmitted disease at the time was taboo. So the film then progresses on to show that Paul Ehrlich was different. He was very much the forerunner of Cochrane. In the hospital, the professor had written out what the treatment was for TB, and one of those treatments was to soak in a hot bath for an hour. And one of the patients said to Paul Ehrlich, "When I've had a soak for an hour, I'm drained, I'm weak, I can't work, I'm losing time off work." So Paul Ehrlich said, "Well, miss it out. And that caused him some friction with the professor, because the professor said, these are the treatments that I have prescribed as a professor of this hospital to the patients, and you dare to tell patients they can miss them out? There wasn't proof that any particular treatment was effective, but Paul Ehrlich, over-empathizing with the patient that had TB, overruled the professor. So he was already in the professor's bad books. And at the time, the light microscope had just been invented, and the professor was kind enough to allow Paul Ehrlich to use the microscope in his laboratory. And Paul Ehrlich started using dyes, and in the worm it stained the spinal cord of the worm, and under the microscope he could see it, and it was similar to that in a human being. He also stained blood. Now, blood under the microscope, all you see were the red cells, sort of partially collapsed balloons. When you use the stain, you got other cells. All you saw were the nuclei, little chain of what you could describe like seeds of grapes inside them, thanks to staining. And the background of the microscope was white. So it was white light that was being used, and Paul Ehrlich described these cells as white cells. So it was no surprise. He was excited. And his excitement was towards dyes. Now, dyes were the realm of women. Women use dyes to dye their clothes and make themselves more attractive. But Ehrlich would be in there, eager to push himself to the front of the queue to get the dye that was new, to try it out on various cells, anything he could put under the microscope. So he was also frequenting women-only shops. And the professor tolerated all this. But then he was in the laboratory, and TB at the time was a major problem. How could you tell the patient, yes, you have TB, therefore, so the rest of the family members don't contract it from you, you should isolate yourself until the cough has gone. So there was this urgent need to find a stain for TB. And so Paul Ehrlich wanted to stain TB, hence his desire and eagerness to try any new dye that appeared and could be purchased. And he was in the laboratory, and one evening the professor, visiting professor, came into the laboratory and asked for diphtheria, a culture, because diphtheria, sore throat, was killing a lot of children off at the time. There was no vaccination against it. And thinking that Paul Ehrlich was a professor, asked him, what are you looking at? And Paul Ehrlich, obviously at the request of another professor, a visiting professor, couldn't refuse. And he shared with him the fact that you could stain the spinal cord in a worm, that you could also see additional cells to the red cells, the white cells. He coined the term white cell because of the white light background of the white light microscope. And so the professor said, well, come along, there's a meeting. Now, Paul Ehrlich knew that his professor had been invited to this professorial meeting, and that's why he was alone in the hospital, totally in charge and totally responsible for the hospital. But this professor, visiting professor, was very persuasive and placed his arm round Paul Ehrlich's shoulders and said, come along, don't be shy. And Paul Ehrlich abandoned his post and attended the meeting, was ushered to the front of the room onto a stage with his professor sitting in the back row, shocked that his junior doctor was presenting something at a professorial meeting. And so Paul Ehrlich was sacked from his job at the hospital. And gradually his savings had been running out. Paul Ehrlich was still eager to find the stain for TB, which had been elusive for Koch, famous Mr. Koch of Koch's postulates, and this shed at the end of the garden with the cast iron stove was covered in microscope slides with different stains drying. And finally, the professor felt sorry for Paul Ehrlich and sent a friend and fellow doctor, and he visited Paul Ehrlich in the shed and said, look, the professor knows you're actually bankrupt now, you've got no money. He's willing to give you back your post at the hospital. Paul Ehrlich by this time was coughing. He'd contracted TB, working with a TB organism. And the other doctor said to Paul Ehrlich, this is cold, you've got no heating on in your shed. Come into the living room, there's a fire there. And his wife obviously had made them a cup of tea and overheard this conversation, felt sorry for Paul Ehrlich that he'd been sitting without heating in his shed at the end of the garden, despite there being some wood, but kept the wood for the parlour. And as Paul Ehrlich and the visiting doctor were having tea in the parlour, his wife lit the fire in the cast iron metal stove on which the slides were drying. And immediately Paul Ehrlich smelt smoke. He'd realised what had happened, that his wife had lit the fire and it could damage his slides and his work. And he made very strong remarks about what his wife had just done, that she could have ruined his chance of being famous as being first to stain TB. But his friend said, look, maybe everything isn't lost. And together they lifted off the slides off the cast iron stove, burning their fingers, but aiming to save these slides. And TB was stained. What happened was that the waxy outer coat of the TB bacterium had melted, and it allowed the dye to penetrate to the wall and stain TB. So Paul Ehrlich, thanks to his wife, was famous. He'd stained TB. And Koch, at the meeting at which he presented the microscope showing the white cells and the spinal cord of the worm, Koch said to Paul Ehrlich, I will shake your hand, you young whippersnapper, because I have spent virtually my whole lifetime trying to stain TB. If you stain TB, I'll shake your hand. So Paul Ehrlich returned to the university, the hospital, and the hospital had afforded Paul Ehrlich a laboratory with shelves and shelves of every known dye that there was. But Paul Ehrlich was not really interested in dyes anymore. He was interested in diphtheria, the bacterium that was killing so many young children. A membrane there was a sore throat, and it progressed to forming a grey-black, highly offensive smelling membrane across the back of the throat that the child will start choking on. And even if you used a penknife to pierce through the trachea, the windpipe at the front, to get air into the lungs past that obstruction at the back of the throat, the toxins from the diphtheria organism would damage the nerve conducting system of the heart, and the child would die. So Paul wanted to somehow find a way of saving lives. Paul Ehrlich, obviously with this cough, wasn't well. He had pulmonary TB, and he was sent to Egypt with the warm air to dry up the secretions in the lungs so he could breathe more easily and to recover from the TB. And while he was there, he was still a doctor. He was famous, and when there was a child that was bitten by a snake, one of the brothers came running and found Paul Ehrlich and said, "My brother's been bitten by a snake. He's going to die. Please, can you help him?" And even though Paul Ehrlich wasn't well himself, he made haste and went as quickly as he could to see this child that had been bitten by the snake. By the time he arrived, the child was dead. But the father said, "I praise Allah." And Paul Ehrlich says, how is it that you praise Allah? And he said, "I have been bitten many times and Allah has saved my life." And Paul Ehrlich said, tell me, how was it that you were bitten and you lived? And he said, "The first time I was bitten, I was very, very, very ill and people were certain I was going to die. But then the next time I was bitten, I had the sweating, the pale skin, the coldness. They thought I was dying, but I recovered. And each time after that I was bitten, the snake venom seemed to have less and less power over me." And that gave Dr. Paul Ehrlich the idea that maybe the human body had produced something against that foreign body, an anti-foreign body, shortened to antibody, that could somehow neutralize the toxic effect of that foreign substance that had gone into the body. And when he returned back to the hospital, even with this laboratory stuffed full of every dye he could think of that was ever known in the world, he wanted to do some animal experiments. And the only animal that he could get hold of was the cheapest animal, a horse that was very old and was going to go for slaughter. And Paul Ehrlich tried then to inject the horse with ever increasing amounts of diphtheria bacterium. The first time the horse got a fever, and then 2-3 days later recovered. Paul Ehrlich injected him again, so a large number of times, and then obtained serum from the horse and was given permission to do a test to inject the serum that the horse had developed antibodies into children that the doctors were convinced were so ill with the diphtheria. The doctors were convinced these children were going to die. There were 50 in a ward on the right of the corridor and 50 children with diphtheria who were about to die on the left. And Paul Ehrlich was to inject doses of the serum from the horse with antibodies in to the children on the right. He'd injected all the children in the ward on the right, and there was some serum still left. And the parents of the children of the control ward on the left approached Paul Ehrlich and pleaded with him to use all the doses that he had of the horse serum to save as many lives of the children that he could. And being empathetic, he ignored protocol and injected some of the control group, and the children lived. So Paul Ehrlich had shown that you could produce passive immunity and save lives using animals to produce the antibodies that the human body would normally produce. So he became more famous, but his dream was still to find that magic bullet that would kill syphilis. He hosted meals, invited rich individuals to attend, and at the end of the meal he would discuss the possibility of treating syphilis. And immediately he mentioned the taboo topic of syphilis. Most of the individuals would rise to their feet and leave. Eventually, at one of these meals, one person remained, and that was a rich widow of a professor. She was interested in Paul Ehrlich's idea that there was this compound, and the shape of it would fit exactly into a receptor, much like a key into a lock. And she said, I will sponsor you. So Paul Ehrlich had funding to have a laboratory of animals, from mice, rats, cats, dogs, to chimpanzees, because if the compound appeared safe in the rat, the dog, the cat, and then he could test it on the chimpanzee, unfortunately it showed that there was still damage to the nerve system by nystagmus, which is the swinging of the eyes in the chimpanzee. So it showed that that compound would cause damage in the human individual. And 606th compound of that heavy metal salt actually didn't damage the nerve system of the chimpanzee. And with the funding of the rich widow, the factory was built. But the demand for syphilis was so great that 3 factories were built to meet the demand. And unfortunately, one of some of the patients that were given the 3 injections to treat syphilis died. So Paul Ehrlich was taken to court for manslaughter, and he was advised to obtain the best legal team behind him, and he said, I have killed a patient. I must pay the consequences, even if that is hanging. You can stretch this old goat's neck. But before you do, I want to speak to the relatives of those young people who died from my treatment. And that was granted. He spoke to the relatives, and they all described something very similar. With the first injection, there was a rash, a nettle rash, a red blotchy rash, itchy rash all over the body. With the next one, not only was there this rash, but there was wheezing in the chest. And then with the third injection, the rash, the wheeze, and the swelling of the tongue, which eventually obstructed the airways, and the patient died. And Paul Ehrlich described anaphylactic reaction. So, in my view, that is what makes a good doctor. Empathy, always searching, always questioning. So I hope you enjoy reading the Wikipedia entry under Dr. Paul Ehrlich and their entry under the magic bullet. Today's taboo topic is birth. Baby exiting through that opening, the oval opening in a mother's pelvis, the pelvic bone, exiting mummy's tummy through an opening in the lower tummy, the opening in the lower part of this bony pelvis called the pelvic outlet, head first bowed, the back of baby's head coming first, acting as that wedge to stretch the fibrous coats of the hammock, the muscle floor of the tummy, to transform the floor of the tummy into a trapdoor. From floor to trapdoor to floor. From floor to trapdoor to floor. The magic of the magical birth canal. Is it not time that this next taboo is put to rest? I say yes. It was the love of Ehrlich's wife for Ehrlich that stained TB. So what makes the world go round? Love. Love makes the world go round.